this is hard work, but yeah, let's keep going. I'm never going to put money towards a Lange, so is getting a Glashuette original Panomatic Lunar the next best thing? Can you mention several examples of what you'd personally consider overrated watches? This is part 2 of the Q&A session. There were so many questions that I just couldn't pack them into one video alone, so I had to split it up for time. Otherwise, I'd be going on for ages. So be sure to go back and watch the previous part 1 of this video. As for you guys, be sure to leave a comment below with your thoughts. Like, of course, if you feel the content warrants it, and subscribe if you're new here. Another long question. As an upcoming collector who was not born rich or has a money printing job, what percentage of savings, in your opinion, is a justifiable number to spend on a hobby like watch collecting? And if you do, let's say 5,000K on a watch as a one-time purchase of an entry-level luxury watch, what would the right approach be? Would you stick to more affordable brands like Tissot or Hamilton? How much you want to spend is entirely up to you, and I cannot and will not take responsibility for your financial situation. Having said that, if you want to save for a Patek, then save for a Patek. As long as you aren't taking on debt and you're still putting food on the table and you're not shrinking or missing any other commitments and you are saving for your retirement, then spending your money on a hobby is, not dangerous. You should not be spending money that should be used on something essential or life critical like a house or a car or food on the table. Again, I'm not a financial advisor. I absolve myself of any and all responsibility. Your finances are your responsibility and nobody else's. Having said that, the 5,000 question, I'm not going to suggest a watch because it's going to lead you down a path and I have no clue what you like. But do this. Look at a lot of watches. Try a lot of watches. Don't get hooked on one. Go down to an AD and try on the watches. And then leave. Go to another AD. Try some more watches. And then leave. Come back 3 months later. Try some more watches. And then leave. See what sticks. Don't rush into your purchase. I'm never going to put money towards a Lange, so is getting a Glashuette original Panomatic Lunar the next best thing? It's not the next best thing, it's just a fantastic watch. The Panomatic Lunar is massive value for money, and personally I think it actually looks better than the Lange. The Lange is finished better. You can definitely tell when the AD gives you that little loop to look closely, but the Glashuette Panomatic isn't a compromise in any way. It's not the I couldn't afford the real one watch. To me, it's the real deal. In general, I'd say Glashuette punch way above their weight class with what you get for the money. 2 questions in one. What's your current collection and why these pieces? And if you had £25,000, what selection of watches would you buy to cover most bases? Yeah, I'm actually a little bit private about my collection. It's not a secret. If you watch my videos, you'll see different watches on my wrist. But a state of the collection is not forthcoming for now. It's a little bit personal and it's not what I want to be the focal point for my channel. But what would I get for 25K? If I had 25K, I definitely wouldn't buy just one watch. I would buy a couple, and there would be definitely a sports watch, there would be a diver, and there would be a watch that looked different and stood out in some way. So it could be ceramic or a funny dial or something weird. If I had money left over after I'd spent the money on those 3 watches, I'd probably get a chronograph with some character, so not just a plain black dial speedy. It would be something like a Tag Heuer Skipper or something like that, or a Zenith A384. Can you mention several examples of what you'd personally consider overrated watches? Whenever I answer this type of question, somebody's bound to get angry because there's someone out there that owns that watch and does not feel it's overrated, and they are dreaming of that watch and they vehemently disagree with me. So I think it's important to preface my statement with they are overrated to me. It's not a statement of fact, it's just an opinion, and you can have a different one, and that's totally cool. The first one is the RLX Titanium Yachtmaster, which I've finally had hands-on with. I know it sells well above retail. It's the only Rolex in titanium. By definition, that watch is going to be desirable. But the thing with titanium is that titanium is a very restrained metal, and this particular titanium Yachtmaster is incredibly dark in the metal. It's purposely not flashy, and I just feel the Yachtmaster deserves more flash, and it's a little bit meh for the price, and like I've said a little bit earlier in the video, 40mm Everose Yachtmaster is much better. Second watch, pink Tudor chronograph. I'm sorry, I think it's a fad, and I don't think the pink is particularly good looking, but people are going absolutely mental for that watch. What I would want would be a Zenith Chronomaster Sport with the pink dial. That thing got no attention, and I think it's the vastly superior watch. It's sold out now. They made it to, I think, support cancer research or something like that. Much better sort of collab from that perspective, and just a cooler watch. Way better than the Tudor pink chrono. Last one, I'd love to throw in a couple of Rolexes, but that's just kind of bashing them. I mean, Rolexes are just sort of by definition both underrated and overrated, because, you know, a lot of them sell over retail. But on the other hand, there's so much, not as much as there has been, but there's still a lot of hype for just Rolex being Rolex, which is down to the brand. But leaving them aside, Hamilton Khaki. The Hamilton Khaki is a super good watch, but do they get hyped a little more than I think they should? Absolutely. If you go online to YouTube and you look for great starter watch videos, the Hamilton Khaki is going to be there. Me, Teddy Baldessar, the Hamilton Khaki is always one of the ones you bring up because it's recognizable, it's affordably priced, all that kind of stuff. But, you know, considering what it is, and it's a great watch, I just think the amount of mentions that watch gets, considering how many other watches there are just as good out there that can do the same kind of thing, that's a little bit overrated. But again, it's a good watch. It's just the talk around it is too much. Another longer question. The latest Grand Seiko manual wind movement in titanium has my attention. So that's the SLGW003, I think. I've been following the brand for years. However, the over 10K price is a showstopper for me. Is there a recommendation for a similar watch? 10K is becoming kind of the low end for titanium watches for those level of manufacturers. I mean, potentially it's even on the cheaper side depending on what you compare it to. It's also hard to find a titanium dress watch. It's not common to see. So options might be an IWC Portuguesa automatic. They've got the 42mm 168-day version one, but that's 13,500, so that's a bit much. But they do have a couple of models that come in at around 7,000 or 8,000 that I think are pretty cool. If you're looking for something with a similarly cool dial, not quite at the same level, but, you know, really, really good, there's Anordain, which have the Model 3, which has like this, I think, lichen aqua color thing, which I'll put a picture somewhere. Anordain do enameling on the dials for a very good price. The movement isn't going to be anywhere near what Grand Seiko can do, but it definitely is an option. Louis Erard have a couple of models that I like. I'll put a couple of examples on the screen that I think have a similar vibe to the Grand Seiko. The movements and the case finishing, again, isn't going to be what you can get from a Grand Seiko, but that's kind of the compromise. If you really want a Grand Seiko and you don't want to pay the 10K, then get a white birch and put it on a strap. It's going to have a similar vibe. It's not a lot cheaper, but it's going to be cheaper. There are lots of dress watches out there under 10K. JLC, not anymore. The Master Ultra Thins are more expensive, I think. But the problem is, you know, the thing you get with the Grand Seiko is that very, very special dial, and pretty much not a lot of people, apart from maybe Anordain and a couple of others, there's not a lot of them that do that thing. So you can get a lot of plain dress watches, but that's just not in the same category. What is the perfect size of collection for you? There's no such thing. My own approach is to have variety, but also to have no more watches than I can actually wear. A watch that gets worn 3 times in a year is not enough for me. Why does Citizen have such little mind share in the watch world? Because they have terrible marketing. From a marketing perspective, they're just reasonably forgettable. Also, in a time where quartz watches are dying and being replaced by smartwatches, brands like Citizen just don't get much attention. Best dress watch, pre-owned or new, under 5K or under 10K? Depends. If you're going for a super classic dress watch, I think you can sneak in a JLC Master Ultra Thin at just under 10K, at least on secondary market. If that's too much, then I'd say a Nomos Orion Vice. It doesn't get much more classic than that, and it's reasonably affordable. Then there's the new one from the other question, the SLGW003. I've got my eye on that watch. It's super cool looking. It's slightly over 10K, but I like it. It's a lot. It's a good watch. If you want something with a little bit more modernity to it, so, a little bit more color, a little bit less formal, then I'd say Lange has a sector dial still, I think. Raymond Weil also has some good sector dials with the Mille Sims. I think their movements are based on Seditas, so they're not really in-house, but I've seen them in the metal and I think they're pretty cool. The Santos Dumont would also do nicely. I've also got an honorable mention, and it's not quite 10K, and it's also not something I'd suggest that you buy new, but Breguet usually comes at a decent discount on the secondary market. There's the 5157, which has a retail price of, I think, about $18,000, and they go for somewhere between 10 and 13K on Chrono 24. That's not a bad price for a really good looking watch, at least on the dress style. I dig that watch so much. How many Gundams do you have in your collection, and did you build them? I have 5, and I'm currently building one more, a master grade Sinn. I enjoy it because it's calming and it focuses me, and it's also something I do with my son, so it's just a fun endeavor with my kid. How do you view Casio venturing into the fitness tracker industry? From a software perspective, I think they are not great. Garmin, Suunto, Apple Watch, they all run rings around them in terms of technical functionality. The interface is still not great. The tracking options are not great. The display is not... It's better than MIPS, but AMOLED is the way forward. I would definitely prefer AMOLED. I also don't think the underlying software is good enough. I mean, I think Garmin are coming out now with the Phoenix 8 soon, and that's likely going to be an AMOLED fitness tracker in 3 different sizes with integrated maps, gargantuan power reserve, just like the Epix 2 Pro. So the competition is massive in that space, and I understand why Casio are doing it. I personally think Casio is a brand that is getting hit hard by smartwatches and fitness trackers. It's quartz watches and watches under $2,000 and $1,000 that are declining massively. And if you're looking for a watch with a digital display, the G-Shock isn't necessarily that compelling. I know Casio gets a lot of love from watch YouTubers like me and from the community in general, but side by side with an Apple Watch or a Garmin Forerunner 265, I think most people are going to be picking the Forerunner or the Apple Watch for tracking purposes. I think Casio needs to do those connected features because they can't really go upmarket and premiumize a digital wristwatch on a silicone strap. So I'm not a big fan of Teslas, and I think they're plasticky, and I think their CEO is a bit of an unpleasant person. But the one thing that Tesla has always been good at is electric from the ground up and software-centric from the ground up. Apple's the same. The Apple Watch is built as a smartwatch from the ground up. The Casios are digital watches that have been adapted to become smart, just like BMWs and Mercedeses that still have that axle tunnel, in the footwell of the rear seat where you've got the axle going through, because it's a combustion platform that has been repurposed to function as an EV platform. Often those cars that start out on a combustion platform and have been moved to an EV platform are inferior to EVs that have been built as EVs from the ground up. Casio have partnered with an external provider for the software purposes, but I do think they need to essentially ditch their proprietary modules and throw in some sort of from the ground up Android type interface instead. Their watch needs to be a smartwatch from the ground up and not a repurposed digital watch. I'm also not sure they have the skill in-house to build that kind of interface that can compete. But if they could, I'd definitely buy a Square over a Garmin Forerunner any day of the week, because Casio does have some heritage and nostalgia that I would support. What's your opinion on the Sinn 903 STBE2? I actually wrote to Sinn and I asked if they would loan it to me so I could do a review, but apparently they don't loan watches out at all. Maybe it's just me, but I haven't had it hands-on and I haven't had it in the metal. But I know for a fact that Sinn make cool watches, and this one is an improvement on the old model in a lot of ways, and just the simple fact that they bought the rights to the design from Breitling 30 or 40 years ago is just a cool backstory. I'd get this watch over a Breitling Navitimer any day of the week. Do you think platinum watches in general are worth their price? That depends a lot on how you define worth it. Very few platinum watches from any manufacturer hold their value on the secondary market. I think you can get a Lange one at half price on the secondary market for a platinum model. You get charged a massive premium for platinum, but it's the stealth wealth component that is platinum. It's knowing that you own something ridiculously expensive and it has a different color to steel or white gold. Actually, a color or tint that I prefer, at least with Rolex and Lange. So, if that's your jam, then it's totally worth it. Again, it depends on how you define value. What is your take on Christopher Ward? Do you see them as the micro brand that would outshine the comparable Farah Formex to be a major one in the next 5 or 10 years? Christopher Ward are a bit of a darling of the YouTube watch community. They do the Bel Canto, they do the 12, they do the moon phases, they do the 12X. They've got this new super compressor kind of watch out. They've done really well for themselves. I'm also pretty sure that they haven't made a profit in 10 years. You can go to gov.uk and you can actually look it up. And I think maybe there was like 6 or 7 years ago, they made like £100,000 in profit. But generally, they've made a loss for a very, very long time. That's because they're on a growth trajectory and they're investing in a lot of cost in building the brand and building the volumes that can sustain a profitable business. I think they are reasonably good, but when you look at the collection outside of the Bel Canto and the 12, I don't necessarily think they're head and shoulders above the others. Their dials are good, but Monta does a better bracelet, Formex does better dials, Formex also has consistently better movements. Other brands are a little bit more creative, at least I think so. I think to make a profit consistently, they need to either raise prices, and I'm not sure their core current lineup at current qualities can carry a price increase. And I think they are committed to this kind of $1,000, £1,000 affordable watch segment. And that's going to need them to get up to some higher volumes. And it's interesting to see if that's actually going to be sustainably profitable over time. So you mentioned Farah, I mentioned Formex. There's no doubt that Christopher Ward are in a bigger space and are larger than those brands by now. And they sort of very much have a lot of momentum. But is it an inevitability that they are going to be the leaders in the segment? Not necessarily, but they're doing a lot of good things. And if they keep it up, they're not going anywhere. But they still haven't quite gotten there, at least. Well, maybe we'll see with this year's annual report. But, consistently getting profits off of this segment is ridiculously hard. And the competition is ridiculously hard. So there are a lot of brands, like I said, with Monta, they have a better bracelet. Being able to keep up with the innovations in the space and, keep yourself ahead and also have designs that capture people, that's a tough one. But they've definitely been doing a lot of stuff right. Just getting back to that thing about pricing. So again, I think that they have this value perspective that is really, really important to them. The question I keep coming back to is, can they get to volumes where they can sustain a profit for that, or will they be forced to go up in price, which is kind of counter to what they've been marketed as? I'm curious as to whether or not they might have to go a little bit up in price to become consistently profitable. And you can say, well, maybe they're making a huge profit on the 12, but there's a difference between making a profit on a hit. You can't be sure that every single year you're going to have a hit. You need to have a baseline of stuff that pulls in the cash. I don't have deep insight into their financials. I've only read the stuff that is available on gov.uk online. I'm curious, but I like their watches. I've had 3 over time, so they're really cool watches. Do you think the market is getting bored or saturated with safe bets from companies? Or do you think there is still a lot of demand for these safe releases and annual color tweaks? The bigger a company is, the more likely they are to play it safe, especially in bad times, which they are right now. There's too much on the line to make a bet on something wild and out there. And also, you don't look to Mercedes for crazy designs or Apple to be the first movers in terms of features anymore. I think we're getting iOS 18 soon, and it's only by iOS 18 that you can place the icons on the screen on your iPhone exactly where you want them. That's how conservative a big company is. That's also why I knock companies like Tudor for saying they have Dare branding, because they are more or less settled and getting less daring. A Tudor Black Bay monochrome diver and a Coke bezel GMT is not daring. They're nice, but daring is not the word that applies. Smaller companies have nothing to lose. So what happens is somebody small does something wild, like Studio Underdog with their pizza dials. And if it works, the big boys tend to jump on the bandwagon. That's often how it works. And right now the big boys are cutting costs because the COVID money pit has dried up. But at some point, someone small will do something exciting, and then the big ones are going to jump on the bandwagon. What's my Grail? Lange and Söhne Zeitwerk minute repeater in platinum. It's never going to happen, but that's the watch I want. What are your thoughts on dailying a vintage watch? Do you have any that you wear versus keep as collectibles or keepsakes? My dad repaired vintage cars. That was one of his things. He would get some old junk heap, he would clean it, he would fix it, and he would get it running. He enjoyed going for a drive and having the thing break down on the way home and figuring out how to fix it. It was part of the enjoyment for him. I don't enjoy that at all. Having something that isn't waterproof, that isn't as accurate and isn't as reliable just isn't me. I also just prefer the scratches to be scratches that I've made. Having said that, at the AD that I often go to, I often talk to the watchmakers and they are super helpful. And I remember one conversation, and maybe they're pulling a fast one on me, but I don't think so. We were talking about Rolex GMTs and 4-digit and 5-digit GMTs, and this is very much not my specialty. The conversation was about how 5-digit GMTs are better to get your feet wet in vintage because the watches are just that little bit more solid compared to 4-digit models. You can kind of get that vintage vibe without all the quirks that come with 4-digit movements and bezels. I'm guessing the same goes for Seamasters, so starting with a 300M from the 90s before you jump into some sort of temperamental model from the 1960s. Part of the temperamental nature of vintage watches is something you can, I suppose, acquire a taste for. But once you do, my guess is wearing the watch is the whole point. I just don't think I ever will. What are your top 10 favorite Pateks? I don't think I have 10. I'm not strong on historical models from, like 20 and 30 and 50 years back. I haven't gone down the rabbit hole of, John Mayer and Ed Sheeran. So that list doesn't really make sense to me. And yeah, I like a Nautilus and I think the Equinaut is nice. And then there's there's some, models, Tiffany dials and which are cool. But of the current collection, I think the one that I like the most is probably an underrated one, and that's the 5226. I think it's a cool Calatrava. It's kind of Murph tool watch, but not really, and it's an updated dress watch, and it's not one of the Pateks that gets a lot of attention, but to me it's a massively cool watch. It's probably my favorite at the moment of the bunch. Also a long question. You have a global audience that you interact with through comments. I'm curious if you see a cultural or geographical difference in watch trends, tastes, or perception. Or do you think the worldwide and international proliferation of internet watch content has most everyone on the same page? That's a super good question. There are two things in play. Whether you are Chinese or Indian or American, all people are affected by marketing and influenced by status. And I had this thought a while ago, about the whole thing where Rolex had ditched Formula One, and I thought maybe they should sponsor the Indian Cricket League. Well, maybe they do. I don't think they do, but let's just assume that they don't. You're talking about a market of 1.2 billion people, and cricket is the national pastime. Whoever imprints their logo on the brains of customers first is going to have a head start. Once you as a customer have that logo in your head, that's going to affect how you view their products. If you've been convinced that the Rolex brand is great, you are going to like the Rolex aesthetic, not because the aesthetic is necessarily great, but because you associate the aesthetic with the brand that's in your head. So that's the one piece. The other piece is I don't think with watches that the aesthetics are completely standardized across the world. I worked for a company a while back where we were owned by a Japanese conglomerate. I had a lot of Japanese colleagues and their taste in watches was very different. There were significantly more dress watches. Their watches were generally more restrained. I've also got some acquaintances in wealthy circles in Bangkok, and there's a lot more gold there. There's a lot more of a preference for gems on watches. Then there's also, every year a lot of brands do their Chinese New Year watches. Rose gold, sometimes I feel, was invented for white people because yellow gold on pale people just isn't always great. All these examples are just to my point that there's no doubt that tastes are different across the world, and the brands do within their lineups try to cater to those nuances. And I suppose I'm rambling a little bit, but my point is that what comes out of Switzerland is not just the Swiss brands imposing their designs on all markets. They're listening to the markets and their lineups. And especially for the big brands, their lineups reflect a selection that will be attractive in multiple markets. If there are more customers in China and Chinese customers want red dials, then the brands are going to offer red dials and ship more red dials to China and all the blue dials to the US. What other consumer goods or subjects do you have an insightful interest in? I don't know if it's insightful, but I'm a big tech nerd. I'd love to be the next Marques Brownlee, but that space is like super crowded. I'd never succeed. I picked watches for my YouTube because I love watches. I considered doing a business YouTube channel on the side, something about careers and business culture, but I haven't quite been able to put my finger on the final design yet, so it's just a pipe dream for now. What watch brands do you feel like could be so much more? I'm a little bit hooked on Breguet for the moment. I don't know why. I've just been diving into their current catalog, and I think some of their watches are ridiculously impressive, and they just get zero love these days. It's a massively mismanaged brand. Do you believe that the watch enthusiast community is dominated by a large portion of people that don't realize their addiction? I've got a buddy who's got a basement full of model trains, Macklin, I think they're called. The money he's spent on model trains easily rivals what I've spent on watches. Lego, the toy maker, has a massive market for primarily men that spend tens of thousands of dollars a year on specialty Lego models. All hobbies are to some extent obsessions. It's part of what follows when you're enthusiastic about something. Whether that's a clinical addiction, I don't know about that. If we ignore for a moment whatever neurochemical things that define an addiction, I suppose there is a piece about whether or not an obsession or a hobby is unhealthy. I'm sure there are probably people out there that buy way more Lego than they can afford and end up in debt because of it. But for most people, I don't think the obsession turns unhealthy, which is what I'm associating with addiction. There's just an inherent obsessiveness that comes along with being into something, and whatever that something is, whether it's watches or trains or airplanes, and it's not inherently unhealthy. It's weird to people on the outside that don't understand you want to spend so much time on this particular thing, but that's why we have each other. Then we can sort of seem normal to each other. Where do you see Sinn's way into the upmarket? I don't. I think Sinn should stay exactly where they are. They are predominantly known for their ultra-solid tool watches, and I think that's where they should stay. They innovate constantly, and they have a loyal following. I think they could, do well to have their own kind of Clive Cussler or some other kind of branding where they expand their tool watch credibility, but they are where I think they're supposed to be, I think. What are your thoughts on GPHG? Which watch do you think will win each category? I honestly don't really follow GPHG. I've got nothing against it, but for me, it's a bit like the Oscars or the Cannes Film Festival or whatever. It's to some extent the industry patting itself on the back, and I don't necessarily go there for insights into what is great or not in terms of who gets an award. I check out the entrance to see if there's something that catches my eye, but the award piece is not something I pay attention to. Whether Andrew McCutcheon or Adrian Barker feels something should get a prize is not going to influence my opinion of whether a watch is good or not. What are your thoughts on display case backs? Are they overrated by buyers or a good feature to expect? Display case backs are good when the movement is good. I think it's unnecessary sometimes when it's just that bog standard Sellita SW200 with the custom rotor. In those cases, to me, it feels like a way to pump the margins with little extra effort. But a display case back on a CQ Pano, totally worth it, even on a lot of the Omega movements. Do you see any M&A potential in the industry at all? Honestly, no. And there's three reasons. The market is in overall decline in terms of volumes, and despite the last couple of years where everything sort of went up, the market is generally under pressure. You don't invest in something that's dying as a segment. It's not a time where Richemont or Swatch start to expand their portfolio. LVMH might, but they're probably the only ones I think that would do it. LVMH have proven that they are exceptionally skilled at managing luxury portfolios in general. Overall, I think, though, that divestment is more likely in the near future than consolidation. Will Rolex start buying? I don't think so, no. I see Rolex taking a bigger control of bigger parts of the value chain like they did with Bucherer, but I don't see them becoming a conglomerate that owns other watch brands. I know, yes, Bucherer has their watches, but I don't see Rolex or Patek or AP buying other brands. What sources do you use to get more relevant, specific, and critical information that are great for watch nerds like us while preparing for the next hunt? When you buy more or less anything, and not just watches, there's a practical or functional component and there's an emotional component. So depending on the product segment, the weight of those two components is going to be different. So a graphics card or a CPU is first and foremost about its practical capability. So how much faster is it? In which environments is it faster? And does that line up with the, the performance per dollar? So, frames per dollar. There's a very small emotional component to CPUs. So some people are going to be AMD or Intel fanboys. It's tough being an Intel fanboy these days because they've screwed up a whole line of products that just burn out and die, which kind of sucks for them, but that's the way it is. But there is, even with that segment, an emotional component. But when you're talking about graphics card and CPUs, the practical functional component is vastly dominant. With watches, the practical component is so much less important. Reviews that babble on about power reserves and METAS and Nevachrome hairsprings are, to me, a little bit pointless. You also can't quantify whether or not a new Rolex is good looking or not in the same way that you can quantify the frame rate at 4K for an Asus graphics card. When you buy a Rolex, for most people, more than half of the buying decision is emotional. And that goes for IWC and Omega and Christopher Ward even. And to me, it's like a roundabout way of saying that reviews and sources like Hodinkee and that kind of stuff are a way to get inspired about watches. It's rarely, for me at least, useful to get any sort of objective opinion of the merits of the watch, because objectivity takes a back seat to the subjective experience. So in my comments, every now and again, you'll have people come in and call people that buy Rolexes idiots. They'll write stuff like, there's no way that Rolex is 10 times better than my San Martin, which is 10 times cheaper. You are all suckers. And I just don't agree. Somebody out there thinks a Rolex is worth every single cent. And there's no reason to name call them and call them idiots just because you wouldn't do it. So yeah, I just look at watches. If something catches my eye, I try to get my hands on it. I come back to it multiple times to see if my interest remains or it fades. And if it remains, then it's a potential buy. Sure, you can go online and understand more about mechanical movements. You can understand a little bit more about release mechanisms and, stamped versus milled clasps and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, there's a huge emotional component. So listening to what others people have to say is not listening to objective statements of fact. It's listening to what they feel about what they like and what they have in front of them. And at the end of the day, you make up your mind as to what emotionally resonates with you. And whether that's a $100,000 IWC perpetual calendar or it's a $400 G-Shock, whatever resonates with you, which is cool. People love the Omega Speedmaster almost religiously in the watch community, but is the so-called best watch ever going to be more than 50 meters of water resistance? Because for that price, that so-called moon history, it's a personal insult to me that such a big company, expert company, cannot make that watch 100-meter water resistance at least. This is a funny one because if you deep dive enough into Omega's website, they say very clearly, if your watch from us says 50 meters, it means that you can actually swim down to 50 meters with it. They do also, I think, somewhere state that you probably shouldn't use the chrono pushers underwater. But basically, when Omega says 50 meters, it's not some pseudo splash resistance definition. For other brands, it is. But with that in mind, in what scenario Do you need your sports racing chronograph to go deeper than 50 meters? Could they build a 100-meter water-resistant sports chronograph? Of course they could. But they'd likely need to add screw-down locks to the chrono pushers, and they need to bump up the thickness. And all of those things I would prefer to avoid. But the key is, specifically for Omega, they say 50 meters is 50 meters. That was a long one. I am spent now. I hope you enjoyed this Q&A session. So as always, leave your comments below, like, subscribe, and thank you so very much for all the support. Cheers.